I have been encouraged to tell my story here. My name is Freya Wilkinson. I'm 20 years old in my second year at university, and I guess you could say I'm still figuring myself out. Some days I feel like I've got everything under control: good grades, a decent social life, and a future that's starting to make sense. Other days, not so much. Lately, it's been a lot more of the second kind. Coming home for Christmas break felt like stepping into a time capsule. The same bedroom, the same faded posters on the wall, and the same creaky floors that made it impossible to sneak out in high school. It's funny how you can leave a place, grow up, change, and then come back and feel like none of that ever happened. I'd been dreading this trip for weeks, not because I didn't love my parents, I do, but being here reminded me of everything I'd been trying to forget. Grant, my ex, for one. He broke up with me 2 weeks before finals, saying he needed space, whatever that means. I told my friends I was fine, that it was mutual, that I had seen it coming. None of that was true. I spent the first few days after the breakup crying between classes, deleting pictures from my phone, and wondering what I could have done differently. By the time I got home, I was tired. Tired of pretending I was okay, and tired of how empty everything felt. I should have been looking forward to Christmas, but all I could think about was how badly I wanted to feel wanted again. I hated myself for it. I hated how much I missed Grant, even after the way he left. But the worst part, I hated how lonely I felt in my own house. And the loneliness, it's taken me places I never thought I'd go. If you're still here, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel for more stories like this. Leonard Bullock has always been the kind of man you notice: tall, broad shoulders and arms that look like they've never missed a workout. He moves with the quiet confidence of someone who knows exactly who he is. Even at home in sweatpants and a t-shirt, he manages to look put together without trying. I've always admired that about him. He's stable in a way that I never was. When I was younger, he seemed unflappable, always knowing how to fix things, build things, and carry more shopping bags than anyone else without breaking a sweat. But lately, something's changed. Maybe it's me, maybe it's him. There's this stillness about him now, like he's somewhere else, even when he's standing right here. Sometimes I catch him staring out of the window, lost in thought. Other times he disappears into the basement to work out and comes back drenched in sweat and smelling of soap and something sharper. I keep telling myself it's nothing, people change, but I can't stop noticing. I try to concentrate on being normal, helping my mum decorate the tree, unraveling the lights as Christmas music plays in the background. I laugh when Leonard makes bad jokes about hanging the ornaments and pretend to be annoyed when he drapes tinsel around my shoulders like a scarf. It almost feels normal. But there are these moments, quick, inexplicable moments that come out of nowhere. Like the way my stomach clenches when his hand brushes mine as we pass the decorations, or the way I catch myself staring too long as he stretches to hang the star at the top of the tree. I hate that I notice. Making dinner doesn't help. My mum hums along to Christmas music as she assigns tasks, but my concentration keeps slipping. Leonard is at the stove, flipping steaks, his sleeves rolled up just enough to show the muscles in his forearms. He catches me watching and winks. My face burns. I turn back to chopping vegetables, hoping no one will notice. Later we watch Christmas films in the living room, blankets and popcorn as usual. Leonard sits next to me, close enough that our legs brush against each other now and then. It's hardly anything. It should feel innocent. It doesn't. I try to concentrate on the screen, but my mind won't stop. This isn't normal. It can't be. I tell myself it's just the breakup, that I'm still raw from what Grant did, and I'm looking for something, anything, to make me feel wanted again. Or maybe it's the way Leonard always feels stable and safe, like nothing bad can touch me when he's around. Either way, it scares me. Later that night, back in my room, I can't stop thinking about the box Phoenix gave me. I remember him laughing when I opened it, telling me to lighten up and have some fun. I was embarrassed then, but now it feels less like a joke and more like a secret, and I don't know what to do with it. The house was quiet. too quiet. I'd spent most of the afternoon scrolling through my phone between TikTok videos and old texts from Grant that I hadn't had the courage to delete. The longer I stared at the screen, the heavier my chest felt, tight and restless, as if I couldn't breathe properly. I needed something to distract me. The fryer beeped downstairs, pulling me out of my head. I shuffled into the kitchen, still in my oversized t-shirt and pajama bottoms, and tossed some frozen nuggets into the basket. While they cooked, I cracked the windows to get rid of the faint smell of the weed I'd smoked earlier. I told myself it would help take the edge off. My body still felt warm and buzzing, like I was floating just outside myself. It made everything feel slower, more secure. By the time I made it back upstairs, my mind was off somewhere else. I wasn't even sure where, just somewhere quieter. I tried to resist the urge at first, pacing the room and checking my phone again, but my eyes kept landing on the box on my bedside table. I told myself I'd just take the edge off, just enough to feel normal for a while. Before I could change my mind, I grabbed the box and climbed onto my bed. At first it was slow, careful. I kept the volume low and my ears sharp, listening for the sound of the front door. But the house remained silent, and the longer I went on, the harder it was to stop. My muscles tightened as the heat rolled through me, and I let myself sink into it, my legs trembling as my breathing quickened. The outside world faded. Then something changed, a burning smell. My stomach turned, the nuggets. Before I could react, I heard it, a creak. I froze, my eyes snapping open. For a second I thought I'd imagined it, but then it came again, louder this time, closer, the doorframe. My stomach dropped. I turned my head and there he was. Leonard. He shouldn't be home. I thought I was alone. But there he was, standing in the doorway, still in his basketball shorts and t-shirt drenched in sweat. My brain couldn't catch up with what my eyes were seeing. I couldn't move. I wanted to hide, to cover myself, to shut it all off, but my fingers wouldn't work. The sound was still there, low, constant, and impossible to ignore. It didn't speak. I couldn't tell what he was thinking, if he was angry or ashamed. But he didn't walk away. He didn't even look away, and neither did I. I kept waiting for something to happen, for him to shout or for me to snap out of it. But nothing did. The air in the room felt heavier, and my pulse pounded so hard I thought it might shake the walls. And then he moved. Just a step closer. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to say something, anything, but no words came out. The long beep of the deep fryer echoed from the kitchen, but neither of us moved. I didn't know what scared me more, the fact that he was still standing there, or the fact that part of me didn't want him to leave. The house felt different after that night. I kept telling myself it was nothing, a mistake. He'd walked in at the wrong time, that's all, an accident. But no matter how many times I tried to convince myself otherwise, the look in his eyes stayed with me. It played over and over in my mind, the tension in his shoulders, the hesitation before he stepped back, the way he closed the door without saying a word. And then the silence that followed. It stretched through the house as if it were alive, pressing down on me. I waited for him to bring it up, to say something, anything. But he didn't. Instead, he acted normal, too normal. The next morning, he smiled as if nothing had happened. He poured me coffee, asked me if I wanted eggs, and made a joke about how I never cleaned up after myself. That should have reassured me. But it didn't. Because I saw it. The way his eyes lingered just a second too long. The way he stepped aside, but didn't quite make room for me as I walked past. I felt it too. The heat on my skin every time he came close. At first I thought it was in my head, but it kept happening. Little things. He stood closer than usual when we were cooking dinner. His arm brushed against my back as he reached past me for a pan, and he didn't pull away immediately. He found excuses to be near me, handing me spices, asking me to taste something, giving me compliments that felt like more than just words. I told myself it was harmless. He was just trying to make me feel better after the breakup. That's what fathers are supposed to do, isn't it? but I couldn't ignore the way his eyes lingered, like he saw me differently. And the worst part, I felt it too. I hated it. The way my stomach fluttered when he touched my arm, the way my pulse quickened when his hand brushed against mine. I hated how aware I'd become of him, the way he smelled after training, or the way his shirt clung to him when he was sweaty. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop thinking about him. I started dressing differently, looser shirts, longer shorts, but it didn't help. I'd still catch him looking when he thought I wouldn't notice. And every time I saw him, my stomach twisted in ways I didn't want to admit. The tension grew until it was impossible to ignore. One night, after dinner, I found him in the basement. He was working out, shirtless, sweat dripping down his chest as he pushed through a set of push-ups. I didn't want to stop. I didn't mean to stare, but I couldn't help it. And he noticed. He wiped his face with a towel and looked up. The weight of his gaze burned my skin, but I didn't move. I couldn't. I wasn't sure why I'd come down there in the first place. I wasn't sure what I expected, but I stayed. And he didn't tell me to leave. The silence was heavier than the air itself. It stretched between us, pressing down, daring one of us to break it. When he came closer, my heart beat so loud I thought he might hear it. I didn't know what I wanted. I didn't know what frightened me more, that he might cross the line, or that I wanted him to. The days that followed felt like a blur. I kept telling myself to let it go, to pretend it hadn't happened, that I hadn't stood there, frozen, while the air between us changed into something I couldn't name. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop it replaying in my mind. The look in his eyes stayed with me. It lingered in the corners of every room, creeping in when I least expected it. I felt like I couldn't breathe. The worst part wasn't the guilt or the shame. It was the rush, the way my skin burned every time I thought about it, the way my stomach turned when I caught him looking at me, like I could still feel his eyes even when he wasn't there. I hated it, but I didn't want it to stop. He didn't say anything about it, not at first. He smiled as usual, joked as if nothing had changed. But it wasn't the same. I noticed the way his voice softened when he spoke to me, the way he lingered in the kitchen while I made coffee, or stood a little too close when we cooked dinner. And I noticed the way my mother looked at him. She wasn't stupid. She saw things, the tension, the distance. She asked him if he was stressed, if work was bothering him, if anything was wrong. Every time he said no. But I knew better. He looked at me differently now, as if he was trying not to, like he was fighting something. But the harder he tried, the more obvious it became. And I didn't stop it. I should have. I should have said something, pulled away, made it clear that whatever it was, it couldn't happen. But I didn't. Instead, I let myself sink deeper. It started small, passing him in the corridor, letting my hand linger as I passed him the salt at dinner. He didn't move away, and neither did I. One night I stayed up late, sat at the kitchen table and pretended to scroll through my phone while he cleaned up. I told myself it was innocent, just keeping him company, but the way he looked at me when I got up to leave told me it wasn't. And yet I didn't stop. I kept telling myself it didn't mean anything, that it was just tension, just curiosity. But the longer it went on, the harder it was to believe that. My thoughts were all over the place, spinning between guilt, fear, and something I couldn't put my finger on. Every time I caught myself looking at him, I promised myself it would be the last time. It never was. I couldn't stop thinking about what it meant, if it was just the breakup making me desperate for attention, or if it was something darker. I told myself it didn't matter, but it did, and it was only a matter of time before it all fell apart. If you're still here, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel for more stories like this. The days blurred together, but the tension didn't go away. If anything, it grew thicker, like the walls of the house closing in, trapping me with thoughts I couldn't escape. Leonard kept his distance at first, or maybe I kept mine. I wasn't sure anymore. But no matter how much space I tried to put between us, I still felt it. The weight of his eyes, the heat of his presence, the way the air seemed to shift every time he walked into a room. I hated how much I noticed it. I hated that I couldn't stop noticing. Every little interaction felt charged, rushing past him in the corridor, reaching for the same plate at dinner, his hand lingering just a second too long as he passed me the salt. And the worst part, no one else seemed to notice. My mum stayed busy, wrapping presents, baking cookies, humming Christmas carols under her breath like everything was fine, like her husband didn't look at me differently. As if I didn't look back. I kept waiting for someone to notice, for someone to say something, but nobody did. And that just made it worse. The guilt pressed down harder, but it didn't stop the thrill that went through me every time he got too close. I hated myself for it. One night I stayed up late and pretended to watch television. In the living room, I told myself I just needed space to clear my head and get some air. But when Leonard came down and sat on the other end of the sofa, everything felt smaller. Neither of us said anything. I could feel the heat radiating from him, even from a few feet away. My pulse quickened, and I told myself to get up, to leave, to go to bed. I didn't. He moved closer, his knee brushing mine. It could have been an accident. It wasn't. I told myself to move, but my body remained frozen. I felt the couch sink as he leaned back, one arm draped over the back of the cushions. The silence grew heavier, but I couldn't look at him. I didn't need to. I could feel him watching me. When I finally got up, my legs felt shaky. I told myself it was okay, that I was overreacting. But as I turned to leave, I felt his hand brush against my arm, light, deliberate, enough to make my skin burn. I didn't look back. I locked my door that night, but it didn't stop the thoughts, the shame, the need, and I hated myself for not knowing which felt stronger. The air in the house was heavy. I noticed it right away, the way my mum started watching him more closely, her questions sharper, her tone tighter. She'd ask him to fix things around the house that he'd ignored, ask him where he'd been when he'd come home late from the gym. I wasn't the only one feeling it anymore. Leonard seemed restless, quieter, like he was carrying something he couldn't put down. He flinched when my mother touched his arm, hesitated before answering her questions, and kept disappearing into the basement. I told myself it wasn't me, that it couldn't be. But deep down, I wasn't sure. It started with a film night, the three of us curled up in the living room. Christmas lights were blinking softly, and the TV was shining in the dim room. It should have been comforting. It wasn't. Leonard was sitting closer than usual, too close. Every time he shifted, his leg brushed against mine. I could feel the warmth through the blanket, and it made my skin tingle in ways I didn't want to think about. I should have moved, but I didn't. Halfway through, my mum got up to get some drinks. As the kitchen door swung shut, Leonard's hand brushed my knee. It was barely a touch, but it was enough. My heart pounded against my ribs and my breath caught. I turned to look at him, ready to say something, but then the door creaked open. My mum stepped back into the room, her eyes darting between us. She didn't say anything at first, but the way she looked at him, at me, I knew she'd seen something. "Are you all right?" Her voice was light, but her eyes weren't. Leonard withdrew his hand and cleared his throat. Yeah, fine." But it wasn't fine. I could feel the shift, the crack in the foundation, the moment when everything started to fall apart. My mum didn't say anything. She just sat down and pressed play on the film. I didn't breathe again until the credits rolled. That night, after I went to bed, the voices started. Soft at first, then louder. My mum's was sharp and accusatory, my dad's was defensive, almost pleading. I couldn't make out every word, but the ones I did catch made my stomach turn. Distant, distracted. "What's wrong with you, Leonard?" I cupped my hands over my ears, but it didn't block out the weight of it. Minutes later, I heard the door slam. Leonard hadn't come to bed. I found him in the basement, sitting on the training bench with his head in his hands. I should have left, but I didn't. I sat on the steps and watched his shoulders rise and fall as if he couldn't catch his breath. He didn't look at me at first, But when he finally did, the weight in his eyes drew me closer. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice breaking. My stomach dropped. Do what? Pretend, hide, feel. I didn't ask. I didn't need to. The words hung between us, too heavy to take back. And in that moment, I knew that everything had changed. The house felt more empty than ever. I spent most of my time in my room, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. My thoughts went round and round, never stopping, never giving me room to breathe. I kept replaying the argument I heard that night, my mother's voice sharp and cutting, my father's deep and defensive. I didn't catch every word, but I heard enough. Enough to know that something had changed. Enough to know it wasn't all in my head anymore. My mum knew, or at least she suspected. The days after were tense. My dad barely spoke. When he did, his voice was clipped, and he avoided looking at me for too long. My mum wasn't much better. She hovered more than usual. Her questions came faster, sharper. I hated the weight of it. But what frightened me more was how much I missed him. Not in the way I should have, not in the way a daughter misses her father when things are tense. It was worse than that, deeper, darker. I missed the way he looked at me when he thought no one was watching. I missed the warmth of his presence, the rush that came from knowing how close he was. And I hated myself for it. I told myself it was over, that it had to be. I couldn't let it go any further, couldn't let the lines blur any more than they already had. But the harder I tried to push him away, the more he stayed. I started avoiding him completely, sneaking out of rooms when he came in and staying out longer than usual when I went for walks. It didn't help. No matter how far I walked, I could still feel him, his voice, his eyes, his hands. I couldn't shake him. At night it was worse. The silence made it impossible to drown out the thoughts. I'd lie awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, my body tense and restless. I kept telling myself it was just the breakup, that I was lonely and confused and looking for something, anything, to fill the void. But I knew better. I didn't know what scared me more, the guilt or the longing, maybe both. I found him in the kitchen the next morning. He looked up as I entered, but this time his eyes didn't linger. It should have been a relief. It wasn't. I wanted him to look at me. I hated myself for it, but I wanted him to. Instead, he stepped back, gave me space and left the room without a word. I stood there staring at the empty space where he'd been, feeling as if something inside me had burst open. And I knew then, this wasn't over. Not really, it couldn't be. If this story grabbed you, if it made you feel anything, be it shock, curiosity, or even reflection, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel.